Hello everyone. Today's case is not only a missing and murdered Indigenous case, but it also involves an elderly woman. And as you will see from the vast majority of cases that are covered, it's usually younger people who get a lot of coverage. And there's nothing wrong with spreading the word about cases about younger people. However, there seems to be not a lot of coverage on our older communities. And I think we need to take the time to also spread the word on those cases as well, because it's just as important to find them. They all lived lives, they all had family and friends that want answers for them too. And I truly feel like after living such fulfilled, long lives, your life shouldn't just end with a mystery that's never solved. Emily Osmond was born in the rural area of Kawakatus First Nation land, about an hour and a half north of Regina. She grew up there, attended school in the area, and eventually became a nursing student. Eventually, she'd moved to Manitoba, and that's where she'd meet her husband, Gary Osmond. In the 1960s, Emily moved to the Yukon, in Canada's Northwest Territories with Gary, who was in the military at the time. She worked as a cook in multiple restaurants in Whitehorse and ran several businesses, including a cafe in town called Emily's Country Kitchen. About a decade later, Emily and Gary would end up divorcing, which was said to break Emily's heart. Her family said she was very old school and thought that, you marry one person and that's the person you're with for the rest of your life. You work through issues. So Emily seemed to be kind of lost once Gary left. Emily was unable to have children of her own, but she would eventually end up adopting and raising her 7 nieces and nephews, along with multiple other foster children. She raised them as a single mother, working 2 jobs, and she was said to always have a clean home. She was also said to be an incredible soup and bannock maker. One of her foster children, named Linda Silverfox, sang, and I quote, "She had a love for animals, particularly cats and dogs. She really enjoyed things like going for drives. We'd collect driftwood and those lava rocks that are down by the Yukon River." End quote. Emily wasn't just a hard worker. She was also very smart. As I said, she was a cook. She was an incredible cook, it seemed. And she was also involved with the Yukon's Aboriginal Women's Council at the time. A favorite quote she would always tell people being, and I quote, "3 things to remember. Be a lady, always use face cream, and women need mad money." End quote. Emily would eventually retire and move back home to the Watukatus First Nation land. She would live there off-grid on a few acres of land with what some people would call a shack. It had no running water or electricity. Others described it as a rustic home, where she lived a serene, happy retirement with around 30 dogs on her property, who would alert her if there was any trouble. She was said to love to rescue strays and collect any animals that arrived at her doorstep, which reminds me a lot of what she did when she was younger with foster kids and taking care of her nieces and nephews. Back then it was with human children, and now it was with dogs and other animals that she loved. One of her nephews, Glenn Osmond, sang, and I quote, "She didn't want to be in a place where people put old people, sitting around all drugged up waiting to die. She didn't want that life. She kept active." End quote. However, Glenn would grow concerned when one day his aunts would end up telling him that she believed someone was watching her property, saying, and I quote, "When she made that comment, I dwelled on it for a long time, but she said her dogs used to bark and she was convinced there was someone out there." End quote. In 2007, Emily was now 78 years old. On September 9th of that year, she would last be seen by a man who would help her chop wood on her land. However, she wouldn't be reported missing until around September 20th. When police would end up going into her home to investigate, they would notice a medication calendar that she would use. And she'd actually marked off on her calendar until September 13th. 4 days after she was last seen by the wood chopper, which led police to believe that she was still alive after that point. Another red flag to pop up was that all of Emily's dogs had been left attended for nearly that week or so. None of them had been fed, none of them had been cared for, which was the last thing that Emily would have done. She loved those dogs. On top of that, the medication she needed was left behind, her purse was left behind, and her vehicle was left sitting in the yard. Again, all of those are red flags. Saskatchewan RCMP Sergeant James Morton said despite all of this, there were no leads and no signs of foul play. They also said there was no signs of a struggle on her land or in her home. Police also included that Emily had no money at her home, she had no enemies, and she kept to herself for the most part. Saying, and I quote, "So there's no reason for anyone to want to hurt her. Nothing seems to be missing, none of her prescriptions, so this is a really strange one." End quote. And that is because I've seen a lot of talk about people coming in and injuring or robbing or murdering elderly people to steal their medication from them. Extensive searches would end up being conducted 25 kilometers around Emily's property. People closest to her were given polygraph tests, and bones were actually found on her property, which were later tested by a forensic anthropologist, which concluded that they were all animal bones and not human. At this point, people seemed to be stumped about what could have happened to Emily and where she was. And if someone was involved in her disappearance, who could it be? I read that police are still looking for information from the public and that they're hoping news coverage will lead to new information. So I'm hoping that this video today can contribute to getting some new eyes on it, maybe someone out there knows something, or at least we could help spread the word. But despite what police were saying, family claimed that there were signs of foul play. They said that Emily's belongings looked as if they had been gone through. And they said that there was tracks in the yard as if someone had driven in circles trying to disturb the dirt so that the tracks weren't left before they left, meaning to them that this was premeditated. On top of that, we have to remember that Emily did have a bad feeling that someone was watching her, which is extremely scary in hindsight. But it doesn't just stop with Emily. In 2011, one of Emily's 17-year-old nephews, Cody Wolf, would disappear as well after last being seen at his grandmother's home on the Musqueam First Nation on April 29th of that year at around 10:30 p.m. After leaving his grandmother's house, Cody is said to have started walking towards a friend's home that was around 8 kilometers away. It was reported to be a very stormy night with high whipping winds and rain. Cody's last known whereabouts were on a road north of Leastock after midnight when he stopped texting and never arrived at the friend's home. Extensive searches would be done on horseback, boats, ATVs, all by Cody's family members in the community. It wouldn't be until 9 years later, on May 7th of 2020, when their family would finally get answers on what happened to Cody. His remains would end up being found on a small island not far from where he was last seen, after 2 youth stopped on the island to search for geese eggs. Now, this area where Cody's body ended up being found was submerged intermittently over the years and was said to have only recently become exposed. In the end, his death was not considered suspicious, and it was said the road he was walking on that night had actually become flooded due to the storms. So it's suspected that possibly because of the temperatures out and the weather, he either got disoriented, died from the elements, or was washed away from the storm and the flood. So easy to say, this family has been through a lot over the last few years, with not only one person going missing in their family, but two, and it being nearly a decade before any answers came from one of them. And hopefully they can finally get answers to what happened to Emily as well. There seems to be a lot of mixed opinions on what may have happened to Emily, whether there was foul play or whether there wasn't. But in my opinion, if an elderly woman who is always at her home taking care of her animals just disappears, doesn't bring her medication, purse, vehicle, her dogs are starving, that's something that she wouldn't have done. It just doesn't make sense that she left on her own free will. And the evidence that her family says was there also sounds very concerning. Her family and friends ended up being interviewed for a documentary for the show Taken. So I'll have that down below. It's a very good watch and you can hear the family speak about Emily. Let's take one more good look at Emily just in case someone out there knows something. Maybe they have seen her before or know anything about what happened to her. Emily was described as an Indigenous woman standing 5'3", around 130 pounds, with gray hair and brown eyes. She often walked with a cane due to arthritis in her hip. If you have any information on what happened to Emily, I'll leave the appropriate authorities to contact down below. My heart goes out to her family and friends, and I really truly hope that they can finally get answers for her. As always, I hope you'll stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.